The city was still yawning into the day, the streets bathed in that pale, silvery light that comes just before the sun fully wakes. Streetlights flickered lazily, as if deciding whether to keep glowing or give in to the morning. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint smell of rain from the night before. Inside the backseat of a black luxury sedan, Ethan Cross sat in his usual position, straight-backed, tablet in hand, a leather briefcase resting on the seat beside him. His phone buzzed with emails, reminders, and meeting alerts. For most people, this early hour was a time for coffee and stretching awake. For Ethan, it was already the middle of his day. Calls had been made, strategies laid out, contracts reviewed. But as the car slowed at a red light near an older part of town, his eyes drifted from the screen to the world outside. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was just another commuter waiting for a bus, a small figure on the weathered wooden bench. But then his eyes focused, and his chest tightened. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was curled up, knees tucked tightly into her chest, her arms wrapped around a worn pink backpack as if it were the only safe thing in the world. Her hoodie was thin, faded from too many washes, and her shoes, several sizes too big, flopped loosely around her small feet. Her head rested against the wooden slats of the bench, her hair a messy curtain across her face. She was sleeping, in the middle of the street noise. In the morning chill. At a bus stop, the driver glanced at Ethan through the rearview mirror, noticing his stillness. "Sir." Ethan didn't answer at first. He had seen poverty before. Growing up, he'd brushed against it, felt its cold breath on his neck. But something about this girl's stillness, it was different. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even shivering. She was simply enduring. The light turned green. The driver's foot moved toward the gas pedal. "Stop the car," Ethan said suddenly. The brakes hissed, and the sedan rolled to a halt by the curb. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped into the crisp air, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. The morning hum of traffic surrounded him, but his focus was entirely on the small figure ahead. As his shadow stretched over the girl, she stirred, blinking herself awake. Her eyes were large, dark, and filled with something Ethan recognized instantly, wariness. She sat up quickly, clutching her backpack tighter. "Who are you?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, as if ready to run at the first wrong answer. Ethan crouched down so they were eye level. "Just someone who thinks you shouldn't be sleeping here." She shifted slightly, pulling her legs closer. "I'm fine." The words were automatic, mechanical, like something she had said before, over and over, to keep people from asking questions. He hesitated. "Where's your family?" She looked away, her gaze fixed on the passing cars. "Doesn't matter." Ethan studied her face, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her fingers trembled even as she tried to hide it. He felt an ache in his chest, a familiar one he hadn't felt in years, an ache that came from remembering nights when he'd been almost as alone as she was now. Before he could ask anything else, the distant rumble of an approaching bus filled the air. She stiffened instantly, sliding off the bench. The bus pulled up with a squeal of brakes. She climbed aboard quickly, never looking back. Ethan stood there, his hands in his coat pockets, watching as the bus doors closed and the vehicle pulled away. Through the foggy glass, he caught one last glimpse of her small figure before it vanished into the blur of morning. "Traffic." His driver called from the car. "Sir, we should get going. You'll be late for your first meeting." But Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes were still fixed on the road the bus had taken, as if staring long enough might somehow bring it back. The city moved around him, indifferent as always. But Ethan's world had shifted in a way he couldn't quite name yet. Inside, something had already decided, he would see her again. The next morning came with the kind of sunlight that should have felt warm, but for Ethan Cross, it only seemed to sharpen the restlessness inside him. He sat at the head of the long oak conference table in his company's glass-walled boardroom, the city skyline stretching out behind him. The air smelled faintly of coffee and new paper. His assistant laid out the day's agenda: 3 high-profile meetings, 2 contract signings, and a dinner with investors. He barely heard a word. His mind kept circling back to that bus stop. The image of the little girl, hood up, pink backpack clutched tight, trying to make herself invisible, had lodged itself somewhere deep. Most people would have called it none of his business, but to Ethan, it had become unfinished business. When the meeting began, he tried to focus. Graphs and figures flashed on the projector screen. Voices discussed market shares and expansion opportunities. But halfway through a presentation, Ethan caught himself staring out the window, watching buses pull up to a stop far below. Each time one slowed, his eyes searched for a small figure stepping off. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He closed his folder, stood abruptly, and told his assistant, "Clear my afternoon." "Everything." The assistant blinked. "Sir, you have everything," Ethan repeated, already grabbing his coat. This time, he didn't take the chauffeured sedan. He drove himself in his deep navy convertible, the engine humming low as he headed toward the older district where he'd first seen her. The streets here were narrower, lined with cracked sidewalks and faded shop signs. The air smelled faintly of bread and engine oil. He pulled up by the same bus stop. Empty. Ethan parked and got out, scanning the area. No hoodie, no pink backpack. He walked a block, then another, passing convenience stores and small diners. At a tiny corner market, he stepped inside. A man behind the counter looked up from stacking boxes. "Have you seen a little girl around here?" Ethan asked, describing her as best as he could. "About 8 years old, pink backpack." The man shrugged. "Lots of kids come through here. Can't remember them all." His voice carried no malice, just the dull tone of someone used to seeing people come and go without stories. Ethan thanked him and moved on. He tried a laundromat next. Then a gas station. At each place, he asked the same question. Most shook their heads before he could finish. A few looked confused as to why a man in an expensive coat and polished shoes was wandering the streets asking about a child. 2 hours passed. The winter air bit at his hands. He was starting to wonder if she'd been just passing through, one of those fleeting faces the city swallows up, when he caught sight of her. She was sitting on the curb in front of an old bakery, a small piece of bread in her hands. The pink backpack sat in her lap like a shield. Her hair was still tangled, but now a few loose strands fluttered in the breeze. Ethan slowed his steps, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he said softly. "Remember me from yesterday?" Her eyes flicked up from the bread. She hesitated before answering, "Yeah." Her voice was wary, but there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze. He crouched down to her level again. "I've been looking for you." "Why?" The word came out, almost defensive. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted. Her small hands tightened on the bread. "I told you, I'm fine." Ethan shook his head. "No, you're surviving." "That's not the same thing." For a moment, they just looked at each other. Her expression was guarded, but behind her eyes, he saw the faint glimmer of someone who hadn't heard kind words in far too long. He took a slow breath and said, "Come with me." She blinked, caught off guard. "Why?" "Because no child should have to do this alone," he said, his voice steady but warm. She didn't move. The noise of passing cars filled the pause between them. Finally, she lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't know if I can trust you." "That's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to trust me yet. Just give me a chance to prove you can." For the first time, she didn't tell him to leave her alone. Ethan took that as his sign. A week later, the same bus stop looked different, not because the paint had changed, but because a little girl no longer called at her bed. In a sunny room with white curtains, Emma, he finally learned her name, sat at a desk, coloring in a brand new sketchbook. The tattered backpack still sat by her side, but now it held schoolbooks, pencils, and a few snacks instead of everything she owned in the world. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching her with quiet satisfaction. He'd made arrangements with child services, ensured she had a safe place to stay, and promised himself he would never let her vanish into the shadows again. "Do you need anything else?" he asked. Emma glanced up and smiled shyly. "Just, thank you." He felt something shift inside him, deeper than any business victory, warmer than any amount of wealth could buy. Sometimes, the biggest changes don't come from boardrooms or billion-dollar deals. Sometimes, they come from 3 simple words spoken at the right moment. "Come with me." Weeks had passed since that cold morning at the bus stop. The girl, Emma, no longer had to wake up to the sound of engines and the ache of an empty stomach. Instead, she woke to sunlight filtering through soft curtains, the smell of breakfast drifting from the kitchen, and the quiet certainty that she was safe. Ethan hadn't just given her shelter, he'd given her stability, something far rarer. He'd worked with child services, arranged schooling, and visited often, making sure she knew she wasn't just another passing face in his life. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crack. She laughed more, spoke more, and even started drawing in the sketchbook he'd given her. For Ethan, the change was just as profound. He had built an empire by chasing numbers, but for the first time in years, he realized that the most valuable investment he could make wasn't in stocks or buildings, it was in a human life. One evening, as Emma sat cross-legged on the rug, showing him a picture she had drawn of the two of them at the bus stop, she looked up and said softly, "You didn't have to help me, you know." Ethan smiled. "Maybe not, but I wanted to," and in that moment, he understood. Sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can change two lives at once. All it takes is noticing. All it takes is caring. All it takes is saying, "Come with me."